Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to a special 5-part podcast series on international due diligence investigations, finding the needle in the corporate haystack. This series is sponsored by Untitled Worldwide. Established in 1985, Untitled Worldwide has conducted over 2 million investigations globally. Untitled specializes in investigations for FCPA vendor risk management, mergers and acquisitions transactions, board due diligence, and screening of executives internationally, in addition to routine background checks. Untitled has implemented tried and tested methodologies combined with new tools to reveal 30% more hidden and undisclosed information other than investigations. For more information, check out their website, www.infertal.com. Over the next 5 podcasts, we will be exploring such issues as when basic due diligence is no longer enough, given some recent government, FCPA, and international anti-corruption enforcement actions. What do CCOs need to know and want to know? What is and what is not working in due diligence investigations today? M&A successor liability issues, reputational damage, how they might be avoided by more robust investigative due diligence. And finally, with the changes in global policies regarding data privacy, the changes in technology with AI, what are some of the innovations and progress we will see in investigative due diligence going forward? Throughout this series, I am joined by Candace Tao. Candace is the founder and CEO of Untitled Worldwide. I know you will find this series useful and instructive. This series on international due diligence investigations, finding the needle in the corporate haystack, is a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello again, this is Tom Fox, back for our 5-part exploration of international due diligence investigations and finding needles in corporate haystacks. I'm back again with Candace Tao, the founder and CEO of Untitled. And today, in this episode, we're going to take up something near and dear to my heart, which is enforcement actions. And given the recent enforcement actions, and really that have not just recent, but literally over the past 10 years since I've been in this space, what do CCOs want to know? And more importantly, what do they need to know? So Candace, first of all, welcome back and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks, Tom.
So Candace, if there's one mainstay that probably both you and I have observed in our careers in this space, it is continually that there are enforcement actions involving companies that have not performed sufficient due diligence, adequate due diligence, or even inadequate due diligence. So how can we improve the process without breaking the bank?
That's a wonderful question. So most companies, as we have described briefly, perform level 1 due diligence. And again, we're talking here about investigative due diligence rather than other forms of due diligence that companies need to consider in order to be compliant with the FCPA. So most level 1 due diligence provides very limited information. Let me give you some context for that, Tom. Typically in level 1, companies typically find less than 1%, can you believe that? Less than 1% of the issues that are out there. And we do know that 90% of the enforcement actions are against companies have been regarding third-party vendors. So if you're only finding 1% or even less than 1% of those parties, I would say that you're not finding the needle in the haystack most of the time. And so CCOs would be concerned about that, of course, as they should be. And so, however, if they have 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 third parties in their supply chain, it can be a very daunting task. Although I would say that probably most companies, I think I've seen some figures that show that the average company has about 5,000 vendors or 5,000 third parties. Still, if you're looking at risk ranking of those kind of numbers, and you're finding less than 1% issues, and for CCOs, they can measure that pretty effectively themselves, then they're going to be missing a great deal of information about bribery and corruption in their corporate supply chain. And that, of course, puts them at great risk for enforcement actions.
Candace, how can companies move from a check the box function, or even if it's simply a level one, into something that really gives them meaningful results on their due diligence investigations?
So from my perspective, when companies start looking at incorporating deep media searches, and we call them deep internet searches. Deep media and deep internet are slightly different things. So deep media is typically looking at aggregated data from companies that aggregate millions and millions of digitized records, journals, newspapers, articles, periodicals, that type of thing. And when you add that to looking at global watch lists and basic corporate financial information, you may be finding, instead of 1%, you may be finding 5% of the corruption and bribery-related issues that exist amongst third parties. However, when you further expand that and do a deeper level search on online, and I'm not talking about adverse keyword searches. Those are very limited also. You can find as much as 35% of the corruption and bribery-related information about third parties. And if you parlay that into looking at executive backgrounds, going further than routine employment types backgrounds, which would look at just criminal history, maybe civil records, education, employment, that type of thing. Routine backgrounds will yield less than 1% issues about executives, but the deeper look at online searches may yield as much as 20%. And so if you've got hundreds of executives in your organization, you can be pretty confident that somewhere between 10 and 20% of those executives have bribery-related issues or issues in their backgrounds that you would not want to be responsible for and cause nightmares for boards of directors later on.
Candace, how do you deal with the issue of so many red flags, whether they're legitimate red flags that have to be cleared, whether they're false positives that have to be cleared, and so little time and or budget to deal with them?
So by breaking out this deep internet search from what is historically be considered deep dive due diligence, when you break that section out, deep dive due diligence really gives you a much broader picture and is truly deeper and more extensive, looking at all available information about a company or an executive. But if you break out just that one component and add that to the level 1 or level 2, you are going to find a great deal more information. And so that doesn't break the bank. It might if you've got hundreds of thousands of contractors in your supply chain. But I'm talking about the smaller organizations where they might be performing, less than a couple hundred deeper level checks. But this would be an intermediate step. And it doesn't need to break the bank and yet reveals very, very important information to enable a chief compliance officer or a compliance manager to be more effective in their risk assessments. And I think that's worth a great deal for most organizations. If any way to avoid these massive enforcement actions has got to be helpful.
Candace, one of the things that we talk about a lot in anti-corruption compliance is risk ranking, that you need to rank your risks and then both manage your risk, but also plan for your risk, investigate your risks, and then strategize around how to ameliorate those risks going forward. Does a risk ranking process also work in the type of due diligence that you advocate?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think it helps risk ranking to be more effective because, the Department of Justice and the SEC say very clearly that they're fine with companies giving a heavier weight, so to speak, to their red flag issues. So if it's not a one-size-fits-all type of program that they're interested in. So check the box compliance doesn't help you to rank risk very effectively. And part of the reason for that is that it restricts the amount of due diligence that's actually yielded for each third party. And so much of the level 1 due diligence that I see and hear of today and people are talking about widely is really more of a check the box function. And that does present a lot of problems because companies are operating under a false sense of security that information is really effectively ranking their risks, and it isn't. It's just sort of putting a big toe in the water and saying, oh, yeah, did I get bitten or not this time? And so the problem is when corporate and compliance officers go to the DOJ and they say, well, we've got this great compliance program, and here are our risks. We've ranked them as effectively as we can. I think that the department's investigators know that they haven't done a very effective job at ranking their risks. And they're reading and understanding the need for this type of investigation and taking the next step. Just as much as everybody else that goes to conferences and attends the workshops and understand what are the developing criteria in terms of all aspects of compliance programs, but in particular due diligence of third parties, since that's a large part of the enforcement action scenario. And so, for example, how does that actually play out? You may have done basic level 1 due diligence, but you've missed the fact that the third party has a director that doesn't have any assets and yet is involved in a relationship with your supplier where they actually are bribing either bribing foreign officials to get the business that they say that they can yield, or they may be representing a company that doesn't even exist at all. We've seen a lot of enforcement actions recently around issues like that. Even astonishingly, look at the Vantage drilling issue, where one of the directors that they were involved with had no assets at all. In fact, I'm not sure that the drilling company had any actual assets. How does that even happen today? And yet it does happen. It's happening all the time. We've seen it recently, in the last year or so, with the developing Theranos scandal, where a major reputable company like Walgreens wasn't conducting on-the-ground due diligence. And that's here in the US. They weren't able to see the lab. They were basically not shown the machinery that was supposed to be running the tests. And we all know the end point of that story. So massive issues there, not only in the terms of fines and penalties that the regulators might enforce, but also the damage to reputation for the company, damage to shareholders from losses in the transactions that are occurring, whether they're based on bribery or just based on nothing at all. There's nothing there. There's no substance of any kind. So, the companies think that they are covered, and Walgreens has, I'm sure, a very solid compliance program. And yet in this one particularly high-profile case, they weren't able to go all the way through with the due diligence process.
So, Candace, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I've been visiting today with Candace Towle, the founder and CEO of Infotal. We've been taking a look at some recent enforcement actions and also some companies that have been recently in the news around what CCOs want and need for due diligence. I hope you'll join us tomorrow for our next episode, where we take up what is and what is not working in due diligence investigations today. Candace, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Same here, Tom. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you for joining me on this episode of International Due Diligence Investigations, Finding the Needle in the Corporate Haystack. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for our next episode. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Infotal at their website, which is www.infotal.com. This 5-part podcast series has been a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.